Imagine this. Your 9-year-old nephew blatantly pours soda all over your laptop, then flips you off right to your face on Christmas Eve. What would you do? Stay quiet to avoid stirring up conflict, or would you stand up and say what no one in the family has ever had the guts to say out loud? That's precisely the situation I found myself in. What should have been a warm and cozy Christmas night turned into a moment that shattered all the unspoken boundaries in my family. And from that night on, our relationships began to fall apart in ways no one ever saw coming. Stay with me. Let me tell you what happened next. Hello, everyone. My name is Lisa. I'm 28 years old and live in a small apartment in Cincinnati, Ohio. I'm a software engineer working remotely for a tech company based in San Francisco. The job gives me the flexibility to focus on projects I care about. More importantly, it gives me the quiet space that fits the kind of life I've chosen to live for years now. Before moving out alone, I lived with my dad, Todd, in a 2-story house in the suburbs. My mom passed away 5 years ago. After that, I decided to stay a little longer. Not because I couldn't start an independent life, but because I knew that when a family goes through loss, sometimes just being there is the only thing holding it all together. The fundamental shift started when my older brother Michael returned from Berlin with his wife Andrea and their son Levi after living in Europe for 7 years. At the time, I didn't think much of it. They said it would be temporary, just until they got back on their feet after an investment project fell through. In the beginning, everyone kept things respectful. So did I. But then on Christmas Eve 2023, something happened. On the surface, it didn't seem like a big deal. But from that night on, the quiet boundaries I had spent years holding in place began to crack. And I realized something more clearly than ever before. There are some lines once crossed where nothing ever really goes back to how it was. December 2023. For the first time in nearly a decade, our whole family sat together around the dinner table, gathered for Christmas in my dad's 2-story house, tucked away in a quiet Cincinnati suburb. There was something about the atmosphere that felt both familiar and strangely off. The Christmas tree was perfectly decorated. The warm yellow glow of the floor lamp filled the corner of the room just like always, and the faint scent of cinnamon lingered in the air. But inside, it didn't feel like the holidays I used to know. Dinner that night was a full spread. Roast turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, warm dinner rolls, and a few extra dishes my sister-in-law, Andrea, had helped prepare. Initially, everyone spoke politely, carefully skirting around anything that might stir tension. Even my dad seemed more open than usual. He sat at the head of the table, mostly listening, occasionally topping off someone's glass. Right in the middle of dinner, I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. I checked the screen, and as soon as I read the notification, I knew I couldn't ignore it. A critical system error had just popped up that directly affected the project I was overseeing. And in our tech team, I was the only one with high-level access to resolve it. I excused myself and went upstairs to my workspace, a small organized room at the end of the second-floor hallway, set up specifically so I could jump into work at any moment. I logged in and started running diagnostics. But a few minutes in, I realized I'd left my authentication device in the car. I immediately headed downstairs, walked through the hallway, and into the garage. After grabbing the device, I quickly moved back toward the second floor. But as I reached the hallway near my room, I froze. The door was wide open, and I saw Levi, Michael's son, standing in front of my desk in the middle of the room. What made me stop in my tracks was what he was holding, an open can of soda, still fizzing at the top. Before I could react, Levi tilted the can and poured the entire thing over the keyboard of my running laptop. I rushed in and yanked his arm away from the desk, but it was already too late. The screen flickered once, then went black. Everything I was working on disappeared right in front of me. I turned to him, my voice shaking with anger, and shouted, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" He stepped back, and momentarily, I thought he realized he'd gone too far. But then came the look, and what he did next stopped me cold, because what Levi did didn't look like guilt. It looked like defiance. He stared straight at me, squinted his eyes, and stuck out his tongue like it was some joke. But there was no nervous laughter, no fear in his eyes. Then, as if that wasn't enough, he calmly raised his middle finger at me, like he was daring me to do something about it. He didn't say a word, didn't blink, just turned around and walked out of the room with the same calm stride, like none of it mattered. I stood there frozen. The anger didn't explode. It sank into my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. Not because of the laptop, but because of that look in his eyes. The look of a 9-year-old who in that moment stripped me of every bit of respect I had in my own home. It didn't feel like some childish act of rudeness. It felt like a deliberate, clear line had just been crossed. And I knew this time I wouldn't let it slide. In just a few short seconds, I had lost all my work data on the Dell XPS and found myself face to face with a blatant act of defiance from my nephew. No apology, no fear, just a cold, mocking attitude that made it impossible to treat this as a simple accident. Since Levi moved back in with his parents, I have repeatedly reminded him that my office is not a place to run around. I told him that space needs to be respected, but my words never seemed to register. Every time it happened, Andrea would smile and gently say, "Don't be so serious, Aunt Lisa. He's always been high energy." Back then, I stayed silent after her excuses, but this time, I couldn't back down anymore. Keeping my face calm, I walked straight down to the dining room. Without waiting for anyone to ask, I called out Levi's name loud enough for everyone at the table to pause mid-conversation. As soon as he heard me, the boy turned his head, then quickly moved toward Andrea, hiding entirely behind her. I stepped closer, kept my tone steady but firm, and said to him, "You need to apologize for what you just did." Still standing behind his mom, Levi shot back with a short, unwavering response. "I didn't do anything wrong." I paused, not because of the words, but because of how calmly and confidently he said them, like what just happened didn't matter. And he truly believed he didn't have to take responsibility for his actions. After speaking, he lowered his head and stayed put, like that brief exchange didn't need to go any further. A moment later, I turned to Michael and Andrea and told them everything that had just happened from beginning to end. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't exaggerate. I just laid out the facts exactly as I witnessed them. When I finished, Andrea looked at me puzzled and frowned slightly. Then she answered in a firm, unwavering voice. "You're saying Levi did that? No, I don't believe it." Michael stayed silent. My brother just sat there, eyes fixed on me, like he was trying to figure out what hidden motive I might have. He didn't ask a single question. He didn't try to understand. Just a long, tense silence. Looking at their reactions, it hit me. What they were reacting to wasn't the story itself. It was the fact that I dared to speak it out loud at the dinner table. They didn't want the truth. They felt insulted for being forced to face their son's behavior. The air in the room grew heavier. Everyone's eyes turned downward. No one spoke. No one looked me in the eye. I stood in the same house I'd known for years, feeling like I had stepped into a place I was never really invited into. At that point, I didn't feel disappointed. I wasn't even angry anymore. Only one thought came through loud and clear. If this silence continues, if this avoidance keeps repeating itself, then what happened today is just the beginning. After watching everyone's reactions in that room, one thing became painfully clear. They didn't believe me. No one asked questions. No one turned to the kid to confirm what had happened. They didn't care whether he did it or not. The only thing they wanted now was to move past it, as if the story I had just told was nothing more than a personal overreaction, not worth discussing any further. I knew I had to show proof to cut through this haze of denial. Without saying another word, I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened the video clip from the camera I had set up in my office. The footage was crystal clear and undeniable. Levi walked into the room with a soda can in hand and tipped it directly over the keyboard. Then he turned back, stuck out his tongue, and flipped me off. I handed the phone to Andrea. I said nothing. She stared at the screen momentarily, her face flickering with discomfort. But after just a few seconds, her voice came out smooth and light, like she was commenting on something harmless. "He probably picked that up somewhere. It was just an accident." That response hit me like someone had sucked the air straight out of my lungs. I turned to Michael, hoping for something different. But he leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and said slowly, "Don't make a big deal out of this. You're the adult. Don't stoop to a kid's level." With every word he said, my anger didn't build. It drained. What rose instead was a hollow, numbing emptiness. They had seen it all. They had every fact laid out in front of them. They still chose to side with the kid, not because they didn't understand, but because they refused to face the truth. Their son did this. I looked over at Levi. He was still standing beside his mother, face calm, the corner of his mouth slightly raised, in what looked like a half smirk. No fear, no regret. And in that moment, I understood something deeply. This kid had never been taught to take responsibility for his actions, and his parents had never really tried to teach him. I couldn't hold it in anymore. I stood up sharply and raised my voice, firm and loud enough for the entire family to hear. That's what you call an accident? You saw the video. Are you asking me to explain this? Are you all blind? The dining room fell completely silent the second I finished speaking. Andrea turned her face away, lips pressed tightly, her hand clutching Levi's shoulder like she was trying to pull him closer. Michael lifted his eyes to meet mine, and this time there was no confusion in his expression. It had shifted into a quiet confrontation. He didn't say a word, but I could feel it. We both knew what was happening now. The air in the room had changed. The earlier silence was gone. What replaced it was a subtle, spreading tension, unspoken but heavy, moving across the table, into each glance and the spaces between us. My dad was still seated at the far end of the table. He hadn't said a word. He leaned into his chair, holding his half-finished glass of wine. His gaze was fixed on me, steady, unreadable. I couldn't tell if it was anger, concern, or something he was still trying to process, waiting for the right moment to step in. I didn't say anything else, but inside me, something had begun to settle, cold, steady, and unmistakable. I kept my eyes on Levi, a tight, nameless feeling swelling in my chest. The air felt thick, every breath compressed under 10 stares. Suddenly, Michael shoved his chair back and stood up, slamming his hand on the table. The sound was sharp and dry, rattling the entire dinner table. He looked at me, fury burning in his eyes, then shouted, "What the hell did you just say, Lisa? Don't you lie to me. I'm your brother." The shout stopped me cold. The man in front of me wasn't the older brother who used to talk things through. He was reacting on instinct, like I touched something forbidden inside him. In that moment, I looked at Michael, who had once been my most significant support during childhood, the one who stepped up to defend me at a family gathering when they called me a weirdo just because I buried myself in computers all day. He once said, "If you know you're right, then you've got the right to speak up." And yet now, just because his son had done something wrong, he was the first to act like I was out of line. Before I could say a word, my father's voice rang out. It wasn't loud, but clear, each word impossible to ignore. "Everyone sit down, now." The room fell into an eerie silence. Andrea leaned toward her son, placing a hand on Levi's shoulder to keep him still. Michael didn't move. His hands were still firmly pressed on the table, and his eyes locked on me. A few seconds later, my father stood tall in the open space. His gaze swept across each of his children and grandchildren, then stopped on Levi. His voice was deep, slow, and firm. "Levi, what you did was wrong. Apologize to your Aunt Lisa." After my father's demand, Levi said nothing. He turned his head to the side, eyes avoiding everyone, fingers clutching lightly at the edge of his shirt. Andrea leaned down and whispered something in his ear. Her voice was so quiet that only the two of them could hear it, but I caught every word. "It's okay, sweetheart. We're right here." My father stayed exactly where he was. He didn't turn around or change his expression, but his hands slowly curled into fists like he was holding back everything he felt after hearing that. At that moment, I felt something cracking beneath the surface of this house, which I used to know so well. There was no yelling, nothing shattered, but something had shifted for sure, and it wasn't going back. When my dad stayed silent after Andrea whispered to him, I thought things might end there. But just a few seconds later, Michael spoke up. And this time, what he said caught both me and my father completely off guard. His voice was sharp, full of frustration, and he didn't bother to hide his resentment. He raised his voice. "Dad always takes Lisa's side. We've never been treated like that." When Michael finished speaking, my dad lifted his head and looked him straight in the eye. His voice dropped, each word deliberate and firm. "I choose to stand with what's right. Being an adult doesn't mean you get to teach the wrong thing and let your kid do whatever they want." Before the weight of those words could fully settle, Andrea cut in. Her voice was quick, laced with a hint of sarcasm. "He just spilled some soda. He's a kid." After that overly protective remark, I looked at my dad again. His expression hadn't changed much, but in the tightness around his jaw and the corners of his eyes, I could see it. The strain of holding back was starting to show. As for me, what bothered me now had nothing to do with the laptop. What got to me was this: the way they were so willing to trade away moral boundaries to preserve the image of a child who supposedly did nothing wrong. Under the weight of rising tension, what started as a warm Christmas gathering had now fractured into cold, growing silence, visible in every glance and the widening distance between each family member at the table. Everything around us was still precisely the same. The plates of food were warm, the wine glasses were half full, and the tree still glowing in the corner. But among it all, the only thing that felt real now was the suffocating pressure creeping into every inch of the table, into every breath. In that moment, I knew I had to speak. I looked straight at my brother and sister-in-law, kept my tone calm but firm, and said, I backed up the data to the server in time, but that laptop was my work machine. And more than that, being disrespected in my own home isn't something I can pretend didn't happen. I expect the two of you to replace the laptop. As soon as I finished, Andrea looked at me, her lips tightly pressed, before she answered. Her voice was tense and cold. We don't have the money, and we don't think we did anything wrong. Michael sat beside her, hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the table's edge. He didn't say a word, no explanation, no attempt to diffuse the moment. I waited for something, anything from him, but the room offered only the sound of shallow breathing and silence that stretched on too long. Seeing how defiant they still were, my father pulled his phone from his pocket, glanced at the screen, then stood up. His voice was weary but clear. Enough. Go to your rooms. I'll talk to you both in the morning. One by one, they left the table in silence. Their footsteps echoed flatly across the wooden floor. No one looked at each other. The night ended with a quiet, aching distance between people who were supposed to be family. I remained where I was, staring at the untouched plates. The clutter still sitting on the table. My chest felt heavy, and I could feel it without a doubt. Tomorrow morning will not be just another ordinary day. After everyone quietly retreated to their rooms that night, the entire house felt swallowed by a heavy, thick silence. Everything had gone still, as if every word spoken earlier had left behind a residue that couldn't be scrubbed away. I closed my bedroom door and sat down at my desk. The laptop still had droplets clinging to it. I grabbed a cloth and started wiping each key, every crevice, doing whatever I could. But within minutes, I knew it was beyond saving. The circuitry was fried, the screen stayed black. The entire machine was now just a cold, useless block of metal. With no other option, I picked up my phone and logged into the company's internal system. I left an urgent message asking management to pause the current workflow. I requested technical support to transfer data and assign someone else to take over the remainder of the project. I had no choice. But what exhausted me most wasn't the work disruption. It was how it all happened, in the one place I had once believed was the safest for me. As I was about to close the phone, my dad walked past the door. He didn't look in. He didn't stop. He only said one thing softly, quiet enough that only I could hear it. Don't fix it yet. I need it that way. I looked up toward the dark hallway. What he said sounded incomplete, like a sentence that had been cut short, but it carried something more profound, something I couldn't quite name. I sat there for a long time after that, in a room that once felt familiar, now clouded by a strange and distant feeling. My mind kept circling back to Levi, his stare, his actions, and the way the people who should have taught him right from wrong had reacted. I thought about the stories Michael used to tell, about the years they struggled in Berlin, the failed investments, the losses, and how they had to work hard to get Levi through school like any other kid. I used to believe they had done their best. I used to believe those efforts would raise a child who knew boundaries, who understood decency. But after tonight, I wasn't so sure anymore. I found myself asking over and over, if adults can look the other way to save face for their child, how will that child ever learn to tell right from wrong? If a child hurts someone and no one calls it out, if no one helps them see the consequences, how will they ever grow to respect any boundaries? And if the parents themselves refuse to face the truth, what will that child ever learn about honesty? I kept all those questions to myself, not because I didn't want answers, but because the more I thought about it, the more I realized what was happening, the more I realized that it had already slipped past logic. There was only one feeling that lingered, that on this Christmas night, something had cracked between people who once seemed inseparable. And that crack was deep enough for me to know it wouldn't heal with time or with polite words passed around the following holiday table. After everything that happened, I came to understand this. What breaks a family isn't some huge dramatic event. It's the quiet way people stay silent in the face of what's wrong, again and again. The next morning, I woke up early. Outside, the sky was still dull and gray, and the winter chill felt like it had settled deep into my chest. But what kept me alert wasn't the weather. It was the lingering weight from the night before. I walked downstairs in silence. No one said a word to anyone. It was like we'd all woken from an incomplete dream. Yet no one dared to speak of it. When my dad called everyone into the living room, we hadn't even had breakfast yet. No one protested. We all followed quietly as if we sensed what was coming. Once everyone had taken their seats, Levi sat clinging to his mom's phone, locked into a game. It was the latest iPhone 14 Pro Max. He sat with one leg draped over the chair, completely removed from the tension in the room. My dad glanced over at him. His eyes weren't harsh, not angry. They were steady and lingered long enough for the whole room to pause. Then he stood upright, hands folded in front of him, and spoke with a voice that was low and firm. "After thinking it over last night, do you two believe your son did anything wrong?" No one answered. Michael stared at the floor. Andrea pressed her lips together, her eyes unreadable. Maybe avoiding, maybe uncertain. Levi kept playing as if the question had nothing to do with him. I didn't say a word. I just watched every glance, every motion, and inside I already knew the answer. They didn't think he was wrong, or if they did, it still wasn't enough for them to admit it. As the silence dragged on, like the entire room was waiting for someone to speak in place of reason, my father, a man who'd spent 30 years as a schoolteacher, slowly stood up. With steady, deliberate steps, he walked straight toward Levi. His eyes no longer carried the warmth of a grandfather who proudly showed off his grandson to friends during their weekly video calls. Since Levi was born, my dad had called him weekly. Despite the distance, he never missed a single special occasion. I'd often sit beside him to watch the two of them laugh and talk through a small screen. If Levi had been raised closer to home, love might have been the bond that kept our family together. But now, faced with the arrogance, indifference, and utter disregard for boundaries from a boy not even 10 years old, I knew my father could no longer hold back. Without a word, he snatched the phone from Levi's hands and dropped it straight into a steaming ceramic mug. The hot tea overflowed at the rim, and the iPhone sank to the bottom with a harsh, crackling pop. Immediately, Andrea jumped to her feet. Panic in her voice, she shouted at my father, "Oh my God, what are you doing?" Michael stepped forward in anger, but before he could say a single word, my dad turned toward me and gave a slight, firm nod. Remembering what he told me the night before, I stepped up, holding on to everything I'd felt since yesterday. I looked my brother straight in the eye. Without saying a word, I raised my middle finger. Cold, direct, and unwavering. My expression didn't change. I mirrored the same gesture Levi had made to me. As soon as she saw me do it, Andrea shrieked again, "Lisa, what the hell is wrong with you?" Michael stood frozen. The expression on his face stiffened. He didn't step back, but he didn't move forward either. He just stood there, eyes unfocused, caught between shock and silence. Levi shrank into the seat, eyes wide, lips pressed tight. He didn't smirk. He didn't talk back. For the first time, there was visible confusion in his eyes. At that moment, my dad stepped into the center of the room. With a stern gaze, he looked directly at his son and daughter-in-law and said, voice low and sharp, "How does that feel?" That feeling, it's precisely what Lisa had to carry last night. A few seconds passed. Then Andrea turned her face away, her hands clenched tightly, eyes fixed on nothing. Michael stared down at the floor, lips tight, chest rising and falling like he was trying to swallow something he couldn't quite digest. Watching them, I didn't feel satisfied. What I felt was this. Finally, something had started to shift, and I knew after everything that had happened, no one could call this just a mischievous kid anymore. As the heaviness still lingered in the living room, Andrea leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the iPhone, now submerged in the steaming tea. The screen had fogged over from the heat, and the dark amber liquid spread like ink around the device, curling along its edges. Her face twisted with a mix of anger and regret. She hurried to pull the iPhone out, tea still dripping between her fingers. With shaky hands, she grabbed a napkin and began wiping the phone down, carefully dabbing at every corner, her lips moving in barely audible murmurs, like she was clinging to some last bit of hope. When the screen stayed black, she turned toward my dad, her voice strained. "Dad, that phone costs over $2,000. That's my property." The moment she finished, his voice came, calm but firm, directed squarely at his daughter-in-law. "And Lisa's laptop was just trash?" Then Andrea froze at his words. She clutched the ruined phone tighter. Her eyes dropped to the floor. She didn't respond, but as if refusing to back down entirely, she finally looked up again, her tone sharp and defiant. "I'll call the police." Without missing a beat, my dad turned to her. His voice didn't rise, but it carried undeniable weight. "Then go ahead. And while you're at it, tell them what your kid did to Lisa last night." That sentence landed in the room like the clang of cold steel. Andrea stood motionless, lips pressed into a line, her eyes blinking rapidly as if trying to swallow the shame rising from her throat. This time, she said nothing more. Michael slumped into a chair, one hand pressed to his forehead, his eyes heavy and cast down toward the floor. He didn't defend his wife. He didn't even try to meet my eyes. I stayed quiet. By now, the anger had long passed. What took place was more challenging to define, a strange mix of regret and detachment. It felt like a thin layer of ice was forming between people who once called each other family. A few seconds after the room had quieted, I saw my father turn and look directly at Michael and Andrea. His gaze was no longer sharp or confrontational. It had softened slowly, like he was standing face to face with the very children he had once raised with all his faith. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't go into a lecture. He spoke just loud enough for them to hear. He said that he never expected his children to be rich or brilliant. Throughout his life, all he ever wanted was for them to live with decency, not to compete or hold grudges, to know the difference between right and wrong. He said he had believed, truly believed, that with the way he and my mother had raised us, with fairness and no favoritism, each of us would carry a straightforward truth through life. That no matter our path, family would always be a place to return to. Whether we failed or succeeded in the world, he had never closed that door on us. But if the day came when one of his children chose to reject the most basic moral boundaries, then he would be the first to say, "This home cannot welcome that choice." Then he turned to Michael. The softness disappeared. His voice grew slower, heavier, more deliberate. "Michael, you're over 35 years old. You're not a child who gets to hide behind excuses anymore. If you still insist on defending something you know is wrong, you're not just ruining yourself. You're teaching your son to grow up and be a terrible person." The room fell completely still. Michael didn't respond. He just lowered his head. But in his eyes, a flicker of shock and doubt appeared, and I knew something inside him had cracked. Something that had been protected for years by a thin shell of pride. A few seconds later, he looked up at me. His eyes didn't shift away, for the first time that morning. With a low, steady voice, he said, "Lisa, I'm sorry, I was wrong." I didn't move. I didn't respond right away. His apology couldn't undo what had happened. But in that moment, I knew it was a beginning. Right then, Andrea leaned down toward Levi. Her voice was soft as she whispered, "Say you're sorry." I looked at my nephew, still holding on to a shred of hope. I thought maybe after everything, he might understand something. That every action has consequences. That apologizing doesn't make you weak. It's the first step toward growing up. But what happened next made the entire room hold its breath. Levi looked up at me. His eyes were blank, completely indifferent. And then, in a clear, deliberate voice, he said, "I didn't do anything wrong. I hate her." And with that, he burst into tears. He screamed, threw himself to the floor, kicked and thrashed, crying as if the entire world had wronged him. No one said a word. We all sat there frozen like statues in the exact spots we had been. The room turned dense and airless, like sound itself had been drained away, leaving nothing but a silence too heavy for any explanation. I turned to look at Michael and Andrea. They said nothing, but their faces said everything. And I knew, for the first time, they truly understood. What they had been raising wasn't just a child. It was the result of every moment they had chosen to look away. Right after Levi's outburst, Michael couldn't stay seated any longer. He shot up and rushed over to his son. His face had gone pale, like he'd realized something too heavy to bear. In a firm, clear voice, he grabbed the boy's arm and said, "Stop it, Levi. This is not how a child can act when in the wrong." The boy kept crying, still thrashing on the floor like every word was nothing but wind passing by. But unlike before, no one stepped in to comfort him. A few seconds later, Andrea started to move, ready to kneel and hold him like she always did. But just as her hand touched the back of the chair, Michael turned and snapped, "Don't move." The words hit the room like a hard stop, cutting off the air. Andrea froze mid-step. Maybe she had never heard her husband raise his voice like that. Certainly not in the father's role. I looked at Michael. There was no hesitation left in his eyes, no room for excuses, no space to blame it on the situation. And for the first time, I saw my brother no longer trying to preserve the image of a peaceful, put-together family. Something inside him, inside the father, had just broken, and maybe from that very break, something else was beginning to take shape. As everything unfolded right before our eyes, my father and I quietly stepped back, putting some distance between ourselves and the tension wound tight like a drawn wire. We both understood that stepping away in that moment wasn't about avoidance. It was necessary to give Michael and Andrea the space to honestly face the child they had raised for the past 9 years. I walked slowly out of the room, my mind still filled with the images I had just witnessed. But deep down, I thought, maybe for a child raised in indulgence and misperception, defiance is the last thing they have left to cling to what they believe is right. I don't know what happened after my father and I left the living room, but a few minutes later in the hallway silence, I heard Michael's voice from inside, hoarse, frustrated, and Andrea. All I heard was a soft choking. So maybe they argued, perhaps they didn't. I don't know. But I felt grateful that at the very least, they had finally begun to say the things that should have been told long ago. And it was precisely what they were about to do next, a decision that wouldn't come easy, that made me realize they were truly at a loss with the very child they had created. That night, dinner passed in a long, heavy silence. Levi stayed in his room, never coming out to join us at the table. No one called for him. No one tried to force him. On the table, the roast grew cold. The faint scent of smoke still lingered from the fireplace, but it couldn't chase away the chill between us, each lost in our thoughts. The dinner felt like the pause after a storm, when everyone knows the most essential thing still hasn't been said. Just as my father set down his glass, Michael looked up. He glanced at Dad, then at me, and spoke in a tone I hadn't heard from him in a long time, steady and honest. I think it's time to take him somewhere that can help him start over. I can't let this go on anymore. He paused briefly, then added, I've already failed at my career, but with Levi, I can't afford to fail again. At those words, my father's spoon froze midair. He looked up, not to scold, not to question. He just said one short, firm sentence. He needs to be taught from the beginning. Camp consequence. Lisa, contact them for me. Michael nodded without hesitation. Andrea said nothing. She sat silently, hands clasped under the table, her eyes fixed on the floor. There were no tears, but I knew something in her had shattered inside. The next morning, I finished the paperwork and sent the confirmation email to the camp. They responded quickly, ready to take Levi in by the weekend. And then, on a gloomy Saturday morning, Michael and I put Levi in the car. Andrea walked him out to the porch. The door cracked open behind her as she stood there, not stepping down, not turning away. Her eyes followed Levi, like she wanted to hold on to him. But in the end, she placed a hand over her chest and gave a soft nod. No one spoke during the drive. Levi sat still, staring out the window. But when the guard post of Camp Consequence came into view, he broke down. He started screaming for his mom, then turned to me, his eyes begging, furious, desperate. Michael didn't move. He didn't look at his son, didn't look away. He just gripped the steering wheel so tight, his knuckles turned white. When we opened the car door, my father was already waiting. He didn't say a word. He looked at Levi, crying and struggling, then turned his gaze to me, a quiet signal in his eyes. In that moment, he wasn't a gentle grandfather anymore. He was a man who had spent over 30 years with chalk in hand, who understood that some children only learn what it means to be human when they're placed in an environment where softness is no longer the answer. As for me, watching the gate close behind Levi, I didn't feel relieved. All I felt was a space opening up inside my chest. I don't know what lies ahead, but one thing is clear. From this day on, no one in this house will live the same again. During the month Levi spent at the training camp, the atmosphere in our home slowly began to shift. The initial tension eased, giving way to a quiet calm, slow but necessary. We all knew deep down that each of us carried our worries about the boy. No one said it out loud, but it was clear. None of us wanted this to happen, but everyone understood it was the right thing to do. Around that same time, my father quietly bought a new phone for Andrea and placed an order to replace my computer. He didn't say anything beforehand. He just left the 2 boxes on the table, each with a small note bearing our names. When we saw them, both Andrea and I declined. Not out of anger, but because unspoken things still lingered in our hearts. But my father shook his head and said calmly, "As long as you've learned the lesson, that's all that matters. I'm not short on money. At that moment, Michael, Andrea, and I all looked at one another, and suddenly we laughed. Not because what he said was funny, but because it was so true, so simple, so undeniable. It left no room for argument. And yet, it made us reflect on ourselves. Right then, I realized, after everything that had happened, each of us had finally learned the lesson my father had been quietly planting in us all these years. And today, exactly 1 year since Christmas Eve, everything in my family has slowly returned to the rhythm it should have found long ago. Michael and Andrea have restarted their lives with a small European deli in the city's heart. They don't argue as much as they used to, and they've begun learning how to truly listen to their son instead of just reacting. It's nothing flashy, nothing loud, but it's a beginning. After returning from the training camp, Levi sent me a handwritten letter. In it, he apologized, partly in English and partly in a few German words he picked up in Berlin. It took me 3 reads to understand what he meant entirely, but I didn't mind. I smiled the entire afternoon. Since that letter, Levi hasn't repeated any of his old behaviors. No more defiance, no more ugly acts to get attention. He's starting to learn what it means to take responsibility. My father, Todd, has become more lighthearted. Maybe because after everything, he's finally seen that the bond between his children survived and grew stronger. He often takes Levi to the library or weekend events in the neighborhood, and I saw him laugh for the first time in years as the family sat together looking through old photos. As for me, I moved into my place 3 months ago. Every weekend, I bring Levi over to the apartment. We play video games, eat fried chicken, and sometimes sit beside each other without saying much. He's still stubborn, but now he knows when to stop. That makes all the difference. And if there's one thing I want to leave you with through the story, it's this. Family isn't always peaceful, but sometimes the most significant collisions allow us to pause, fix what's broken, and begin again, this time with more clarity and love. That Christmas didn't bring me a gift wrapped in shiny paper, but it left my family with a lesson we'll carry for the rest of our lives. That's where my story ends. And before I close this chapter, I want to ask you, those of you who have stayed with me through every moment of this journey, was I wrong for choosing to speak up that Christmas night instead of keeping the peace and staying silent? I genuinely love to hear your thoughts. Please share your perspective. Your voice matters to me. If the story touched something in you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and walk with me on the journeys still to come. Thank you sincerely for being here.